Good morning and welcome to ELS Talk, Language and Post-Colonial Policy in Africa. My name is Clara Pontificia and I will be the Master of Ceremony of today's event. Firstly, I would like to welcome the Director of the Graduate Program of Universitas SANATA DHARMA, Bapak FX Mukarto PhD, the Head of English Language Studies, Bapak Paulus Sarwoto PhD, our speakers, Professor John Myhill and Professor Dephine Kessy, the lecturers and staff of ELS, and all of the participants both joining us online and on site. Finally, I would like to thank everyone for attending and participating in today's talk. Before we start, let's pray so this event will run smoothly. The prayer will be done universally. Pray, begin. Amen. Now we will listen to the welcome speech from the Director of the Graduate Program of SANATA, Universitas SANATA DHARMA, Bapak FX Mukarto PhD. Pak Mukarto, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, both offline and also online. Welcome to the English Language Studies Graduate Program, SANATA DHARMA University. Also, welcome Professor John Myhill. And we also have Professor Kessy from the University of Tanzania. I think we have also attended participant here from Tanzania. Yeah, so welcome. Also welcome everybody here. It is really nice to see you all. Today we will have a talk by both experts, Professor John Myhill and Professor Dephine Kessy, about the language and post-colonial policy in Africa. I believe this is very interesting and it will be very also enriching, because Africa is so big, with around 54 countries, and the number of languages is also very big, probably around 2,000, much more than what we have here in Indonesia, although here in Indonesia we also have a big number of languages, which is more or less almost 800. So it will be really interesting to learn about the languages, and also the policy in Africa. This is also an opportunity for us all to learn from the experts. Professor Myhill is from University of Haifa, and then the other expert, the other speaker, Professor Kessy, is from Tanzania, so she herself is an African who I believe knows very well about Africa. And we are also very happy because here we have also Tanzanian students. I do not know where you study, whether here SANATA DHARMA or in other universities. Here SANATA DHARMA, yes. The English Language Studies used to have students as well from Tanzania, probably around, I think more than 5 students from Tanzania, but they have graduated already. So it's really nice to have them all here. I hope the seminar today, the talk today, will be very useful for ourselves and also for our understanding of the African languages and also the policy there. Yeah. I hope also that this will enrich us as academicians. The host of this seminar is the English Language Studies graduate program in collaboration with SI, yeah? SI, English Studies Association of Indonesia. Yeah? So thank you very much. All right, so I think this is my welcoming address to you. Enjoy the seminar and learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Mukarto, for the welcome speech, for the greetings. Ladies and gentlemen, now it is time for the most anticipated session for today. As we already know, today we are joined by two amazing speakers, Professor John Myhill from Haifa University, Israel, and Professor Dephine Kessy from St. Augustine University, Tanzania, who will be presenting their materials in succession. Therefore, I would like to invite firstly our moderator, the head of ELS, Bapak Paulus Sarwoto, PhD, along with the first speaker, Professor John Myhill. Pak Sarwoto and Professor Myhill, the floor is yours.
Good morning, dear audience and our esteemed speakers today. Welcome to ELS talk in 2023. This program is hosted by Magister Kajian Bahasa Inggris, Universitas SANATA DHARMA. And our topic today is on linguistics, and usually we also have other two topics, literature and education, because in our department we have three different concentrations. Yeah. And the topic today is language and post-colonial policy in Africa. Yeah. And the topic came out from my personal correspondence with Professor Myhill, as well as with Professor Dephine from St. Augustine University in Tanzania. And I find this topic is interesting because African states are post-colonial states like Indonesia. Yeah. I do not mean to homogenize the colonial experience, because Indonesia was colonized by Dutch, by British, by Japanese, and we possess specific characteristics because of that. Yeah. So for instance, in terms of the colonial policy during Dutch and Japanese colonization. Yeah. Dutch colonization started with the occupation of the East Indies by a multinational company, VOC. Yeah. Before finally taken over by the Netherlands government. Maybe because it is initiated by a multinational company, they were never interested in making the people of Dutch East Indies to speak Dutch. Yeah. By the end of Dutch colonialism, no more than 3% of the population in the Dutch East Indies, or present-day Indonesia, were able to speak Dutch and write in Dutch fluently. Yeah. But maybe because of such policy, yeah, it was even beneficial for decolonization, because the people then had to invent their own national language. And the situation is supported by the Japanese, who forbade the use of Dutch during their occupation, yeah, and they encouraged people to speak their own language. So this morning we have a special occasion to learn the connection between language and post-colonial policy in African context. Yeah. We have a very good time this morning to learn how other post-colonial states might have similar or different experience about the colonial policy, especially related to language policy. And our guest speakers today, professors from 2 different universities. Yeah. Professor John Myhill is from Haifa University, Israel. And we also have Professor Dephine Kessy from St. Augustine University, South University in Tanzania, yeah, who is joining us via Zoom. But before we get to the talk, let me introduce both speakers. Yeah. Our first speaker is Professor John Myhill, sitting next right to me. Got his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1984. He taught in SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York, Buffalo, and the University of Michigan until 1994. Yeah. He's been teaching in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Haifa since 1995. His research specialties include sociolinguistics, semantics, language planning, focusing on the relationship between language and identity, and the development of indigenous languages of East Africa. Yeah. He is the author of numerous books, some of them are Language, Religion, and National Identity in Europe and Middle East, a historical study. Yeah. And another one is Language and Jewish Society Towards a New Understanding. And another book is Typological Discourse Analysis, yeah, published by Blackwell Publishers back in 1992. Yeah. And later on, our second speaker, let me just also introduce the second speaker now. Professor Dephine Kessy is a senior lecturer of tourism studies, yeah, and was recently appointed Deputy Director of Research, Innovation and Community Engagement in St. Augustine University of Tanzania, South. Yeah. She has held different positions in the tourism industry, including serving as a director in different boards. She also chaired the Ganzut House Renovation Committee, a colonial house thought to be useful for heritage and cultural preservation. Apart from being a co-founder of tourism department at St. Augustine University in Tanzania, she has also founded the Ganzut House Foundation and is currently its CEO. Yeah. This morning, each speaker will have 45 minutes to present their paper, and then we will continue with question and answer session. Audience who are attending our program via Zoom, you might want to later on type your question via chat box, and I will do my best to cover all the questions addressed this morning, both online and offline. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Myhill to present his paper. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. There is a handout which I think everybody should have. You have handouts? Okay. I'm going to be talking today about colonial and post-colonial language policy in Africa. I want to start by introducing myself. I'm a linguist at the University of Haifa in Israel. Since 2011, my work has focused on East African languages, specifically in South Sudan and Sudan. And during this time, I have traveled to East Africa more than 20 times, to South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. This is obviously only a few countries in Africa, so I don't have such extensive experience. And also, my work there has focused on developing languages. I'm really a linguist. as written languages with NGOs there, not language planning. Language planning is not my specialty. So I am going to talk, though, here about what I have learned in the last 12 years about this from my experience. Last year, I gave a talk in this same room, actually, about language, religion, and national identity, and I realized at that time that there is great interest in colonialism and the effects of colonialism on the societies, on the post-colonial societies. And so I thought for my trip here this year, I should focus on that topic since people here seem to be interested. I don't know so much about Indonesia, a little bit, but I do know somewhat more about Africa, so I thought this would be a good thing to compare. So, to start off with, we have to make a basic distinction in Africa between three situations. First of all, those countries in Africa which use African languages as their official state languages. Okay? Second, those countries in Africa which use European colonial languages, English or French or Portuguese, as their state languages. And third, those countries in Africa whose main state language is Arabic, which was brought to Africa in the Arab invasions starting in the 7th century. So the first group, the only countries in Africa, I think, which use indigenous African languages, in other words, really African languages, as their state language are Somalia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. I think that's it. Somalia uses Somali as its main state language. Tanzania, as far as I know, uses Swahili as its main state language. And Ethiopia now has a federal language policy. So this means that each state in Ethiopia decides its own language policy. There are 13 states. In principle, each state determines its own language policy according to who lives in the state. So in practice, what this means is that Amharic and Oromo are the main languages there because they have the most speakers, and they are spoken in the biggest area in the country. Is my speed of speaking okay, or should I go slower? Is it okay? Okay, good.
But don't go too fast.
But
don't go too fast.
But tell me if I'm going too fast, because sometimes I get excited and I forget and all this. Okay, so about the third type, classical Arabic, Fusha, is used as the state language in the countries of North Africa, in Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. And it is important to emphasize that classical Arabic is completely different from the spoken Arabic dialects, which also differ from one place to another. But in the great majority of African countries, the official language, state language today, essentially the only language which is used in government and in education past, let's say, 2nd or 3rd grade, is a European colonial language. In almost all cases, this is English or French. It is also Portuguese in a few countries, like Angola, Mozambique. So we can say that in general, post-colonial African countries have had a different policy from Indonesia. Because in Indonesia, there was an indigenous language, a language spoken here, Indonesian, which was adopted as its national language, rather than Dutch, the colonial language. I realize that Indonesian, and when I say it is an indigenous language, I mean there are ethnic Malays in Indonesia, who basically speak the same language. In any case, it is certainly not a European language. So more or less the situation in almost all African countries is completely different from the situation in Indonesia. This is my point. Later in this talk, I will discuss those few African countries which did adopt indigenous African languages as their state languages, but I'm going to focus now on the normal situation in Africa, which is that they only have European languages. Okay? So, why did this happen? Why did African countries, why do they have a different situation? So I want to say at the very beginning that the result of having a completely foreign language used as your state language has been a disaster in Africa. Okay, you can imagine, these are not languages spoken there, they are languages spoken in Europe, which are completely different from the native languages. You can imagine, so for example, if in the United States it was decided that the national language there should be Swahili, and that all school and government should be in Swahili, of course, very few people, it would be very hard, and if you don't know Swahili, well then you go to school, and your teacher talks to you in Swahili, your books are all in Swahili, and you do the best you can. You can see it would be a disaster. But this is the situation in almost all African countries. This is what African countries have chosen to do. Okay? The result of this is mass illiteracy, as you can imagine. More than half of the people in Africa are functionally illiterate, which means that they basically can't read more than a basic sentence. And from my own estimate, I would guess that maybe 3/4 of the people in Africa are not able to use a language beyond very simple basic, in other words, in their professional life. In South Sudan, the country which I'm most familiar with, I'm sure that it is not even 10% who can read and write. You know, they can write their name, a little bit more, but that's it, okay? Sir, I don't think even 10% realistically, okay? In other African countries, maybe it's a little bit better, but I don't think so. No, obviously this is not true of the Tanzanians who are here, because I assume that they study in English, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is, you are the
economic management, tourism.
Okay, but the language is English.
English, of course.
They don't study in Swahili.
No.
Okay. Okay. So obviously the Tanzanians who are here do not represent the typical Tanzanian population.
Can speak Swahili.
So if we see this, it is easy to see why Africa is the poorest place in the world. Okay, because if you go to school in a language which almost nobody can read and speak, then clearly your economy is not going to do very well. Okay, it does not take a genius to see this. Now, to compare the situation in Indonesia, although, of course, for almost all Indonesians, Indonesia is not a native language. Okay, you speak Javanese, right? You speak Javanese or Sundanese or Minangkabau, whatever. Okay, but these languages are all Austronesian languages, and they're pretty similar. Okay, it is not like taking a completely foreign language, which is not related to your native language, and saying this and having this be the official language. I think the situation in Indonesia is somewhat similar to Tanzania, as I understand, where Swahili is the national language, but the rest of you almost everyone speaks some other Bantu language, which is a little bit similar to Swahili, except there's Maasais, okay, but other than them, okay? But in most places in Africa, it is a completely unrelated language. So let us return to the question. So given this fact, why have African countries adopted a language policy which is destroying their own economies? Okay? So my first guess, when I was thinking about this in comparison, was to say, maybe it is because of the situation before the colonial period. After all, classical Malay had long been developed as a literary language, as a written language, before the Europeans even came here. And so what had to be done was you took classical Malay and you started to write it with Latin script instead of Arabic script, but it was already there, and people already thought of it as being a written language. Now my specialization is East Africa. And in East Africa, there was no language like that, okay? Swahili has only been written for about 150 years. And it was before the colonial period, even Swahili was barely written. So I thought maybe the situation was different before. But when I investigated, it turned out it isn't true. In West Africa, in West Africa, before the colonial period, there were a number of languages which were used as written languages and which they were brought by the Muslims when they came. Kanuri, Songhai, Hausa, Wolof, Yoruba, and Fulani, using the Arabic script, which the Muslims brought. They brought the script, and then it was used to write some African languages. But none of these were made the language of a modern country. In other words, they came to a situation which was like Bahasa, with classical Malay, and they just pretended they didn't exist. Okay? Now, another thing which I wanted to do is I want to talk a little bit about the situation in the Soviet Union. Okay? I know I think most of you were born after the Soviet Union fell, but you know about the Soviet Union, right? It existed between 1922 and I think 1991. And if we look at that, we see something interesting. We see that if the European colonizers, if they want to develop the indigenous languages as written languages, they can do it. So what happened was, when the Soviet Union was established in 1922, it inherited the empire which the Russians had been building for several hundred years. It was a multi-ethnic empire. They had a lot of different languages. When the Soviet Union was founded, there was about 130 languages spoken there. Only 3 of them were written languages. The only 3 written languages were Armenian, Georgian, and Russian. None of the others were written languages. But early on in the Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders, particularly Lenin, decided that everyone should be educated in their native languages. Particularly, they should be educated if it was one of the Union republics. In other words, one of the republics which was designated as a separate political entity inside the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was made up of a number of different republics. So the original Union republics were Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And later on they added Kyrgyzstan and Moldova. All of these, other than Russian, Armenian, and Georgian, were unwritten languages. So they had to send linguists, and they had to develop these as written languages. And that's what they did. And that's the situation today. They developed standardized writing systems, they wrote grammars, they made dictionaries, they invented new words in the course of just a few years. By the late 1920s, all of these were written languages. Of course, not everybody read them yet because they needed education, but at least they had them. And the result of this was that when the Soviet Union became independent in the early 1990s, it divided up into Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, 15 different countries, and every country had its own language, its own written language, and every country used the language which people there spoke as their written language, rather than Russian, except Russian. Of course, the Russians used Russian, but everyone else did not. Okay? And actually, the truth is the situation was already, within one generation, by 1960, the situation was fine in this regard. Okay? And there's more or less universal literacy. In other words, in countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, 99% of the population can read and write. Okay? And this is what you expect. If you go to school in your native language, you know, and that's what you're expected to do, then it's not very difficult. So we see then that what was important was not the situation of the countries before you went there. It was not the colonizers came there. It was not the fact that it was Europeans, because Russians are also Europeans. It was not the fact that there wasn't very long to do it, because the Soviet Union, they solved the problem. It was specifically the policies of the British, the French, and the Portuguese which was different. That was what was different. Not the situation before, not the fact that they were colonizers. It is what the British, French, and Portuguese did. That was what was different, okay? So, On the other hand, it was not so simple as that, because outside of Africa, there was a somewhat different situation. Outside of Africa, European colonizers created nation states, in some cases, based upon a specific nationality. So what do I mean by specific nationality? Malaysia is an example, okay? Malaysia is a nation state of the Malay people. Okay, you can see in the name, it's very simple, okay? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, these are all nation states, okay? And that is what happened in these states. Also, Sri Lanka is a nation state. Sinhala is their national language. Burma is a nation state. Sri Lanka was a British colony, Malaysia was a British colony, Burma was a British colony. So the British sometimes did create nation states. In Africa, they didn't. Okay? In other cases, the post-colonial state was this big collection of a whole bunch of people. Indonesia is an example of this, okay? So they took a lot of different groups, Javanese, Sundanese, Balinese, Madurese, and they put them into one big state, okay? But it was a very big state, like Indonesia. The same general thing happened. India was like this, Pakistan was like this, and the Philippines was like this. In other words, you made a very big state, but it combined a lot, and it combined a lot of groups. But in post-colonial Africa, they didn't do this. They drew borders without any relationship with the people who were living there. In other words, Tanzania, there is no Tanzan people. Okay, there's no language called Tanzan, okay, or Tan or Zan. Okay, in Nigeria, that isn't even an African word. It just means land of black people, okay? You don't have this situation. Furthermore, the nation states which they made were usually pretty small. They were not like Indonesia or India. Okay? What factors were used? One factor was that when the British and French divided up the territory, they said, okay, if this was a British colony, if we had a British colony here and a French colony here, then we're just going to say, and we have a country afterwards, which is created on the basis of this, then we are going to separate them. And if the same people live in the British side and the French side, we don't care, because the British made the borders. Okay? In some cases, they did the same even with the German colonies. When Germany controlled some African countries until World War I. When they lost World War I, they were taken away from them and given to other countries. Tanzania was a German colony. You guys know this, right? Okay. So what is the basis for the distinction between Tanzania and Kenya? It's very simple. Kenya was colonized by the British, and Tanzania was colonized by the Germans. And interestingly, after Tanzania was taken away from the Germans after World War I and given to the British still kept them separate. In some cases, even though the same area was controlled by the same country, they made divisions. So if we compare Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya, all three of them were controlled by the British. And in fact, if you look at the borders of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, Kenya, Sudan, and Uganda, the people on the three sides, on these three countries, they all speak the same language. Also on the Ethiopian side, they speak the same language. And it didn't matter. They didn't care. This was an administrative unit, meaning the British government said, here's a border, here's a border, here's a border. We don't care who lives there. This is the way we're going to make the border, because it was for their own convenience, okay? Now, I want to compare this with a situation with what the Soviets did. Now, actually, I probably should have had a map here, but I don't, okay? So if you look at Central Asia, you will see there are now 5 countries. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. 5 countries. Why are there those 5 countries? I'll tell you why. In Tajikistan is different. Tajikistan speaks an Indo-Iranian language. It is related to Persian, for example, whereas the others all speak Turkic languages. So that's why. Why is Uzbekistan separate from Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan? Very simple. The Uzbeks are planters. They have crops, they're farmers. The Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs, and the Turkmen are herders, or at least they were. They have their camels, they have their goats and sheep and stuff, okay? And so they recognize you don't want to put these people together, so they separated them. Why are the Turkmen different from the Kazakhs? Because they neighbor each other, they're both herders, they both speak Turkic languages, but the languages are really different. They can't understand each other, okay? Why are the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz different? Because the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz live next to each other, they are both herders, and their languages are very similar. The truth is, initially they were the same. But after a while, after about 1936, the Kyrgyz decided that they didn't want to be connected with the Kazakhs. Because historically, the Kyrgyz had been with the Uzbeks rather than the Kazakhs. I don't want to go into the details. The point is they sent anthropologists and they sent linguists, and they think, where should we make these borders? Where should we draw these borders so that it is linguistically reasonable and it is culturally reasonable? And in the case of the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz, so it's historically reasonable. They thought about the borders. That's not what the British and French and Portuguese did. They just went boom, 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 boom. That's it. Okay? So, let's move ahead now. Again, the Europeans could have done that. The British and French and Portuguese could have done that, and they didn't. Instead, essentially what they did in Africa is they pretended as though the Africans didn't exist. They didn't care what languages the Africans had. They didn't care what history there was. They didn't care what the cultural, religious, they pretended as though Africa was empty. Admittedly, Africa has people, but when they made the borders, they pretended as though Africa didn't have people and didn't have a history. So, they created a situation in which they made up their own borders and they said, use our languages. The thinking seems to have been that eventually Africans can become Europeans. I think. I mean, the whole idea makes so little sense that I can't really even understand what their thinking would have been. And the truth is they didn't do that anywhere else in the world. So it's not like you could compare and say, I see, okay, this is the way the British thought or French thought. No, it isn't how they thought. They only thought that way in Africa. Okay? Why did they think that way? I don't know. I mean, we have to keep in mind when these borders were drawn, when these policies were made, there was an assumption that Africans are intellectually inferior. I guess. I mean, and maybe they thought that maybe Indonesians we have to take seriously, but Africans we don't have to take seriously. I don't know. I mean, whatever it is was crazy, okay? We can't really give it a logical explanation, but I'm guessing, okay? But what is clear was that it was not just British and French. It was not just the colonial situation. It was something about the way, and it was not just being Europeans, because the Russians weren't like that. It was a combination of the way Western Europeans think about Africans. That was what it was, okay? There was something about it, okay? And the claim at the time, what they said was, we are preparing Africans to be independent. And you even see this today. And they weren't preparing them to be independent, they were preparing them to be dependent. If you prepare someone to be independent, you don't teach them you don't tell them you should use our languages. That's not independent, that's dependent. They were preparing Africans to be dependent upon them in the future, in the post-colonial period. And that's why I want to draw the connection with post-colonial policy. Because you can't understand, the only way you can understand post-colonial policy in Africa is by understanding colonial policy in Africa, because it's a continuation. Obviously in Indonesia it changed when you became independent, and in Tanzania it changed, okay? But Tanzania is the only African country where it changed. Maybe you could say Somalia, it changed a little bit. But Ethiopia was never colonized. Okay? Okay, so I want to give a little bit of a caveat though. African languages have been used in education in these countries up to the 3rd grade in some cases. So I have this on the handout. On educational grounds, we recommend this. You can read this from the handout, okay? This is a statement from UNESCO in '53. On educational grounds, we recommend that the use of the mother tongue be extended to as late a stage in education as possible. In particular, pupils should begin their schooling through the medium of the mother tongue because they understand it best, and because to begin their school life in the mother tongue will make the break between the home and the school as small as possible. So they do have this policy. The problem is that this policy does not extend past 3rd grade, normally. And usually it doesn't even get there. And what is the point in educating people in their native language if after 3rd grade their native language is never used as a written language? What's the point? It is very superficial. I should say what my own position is. My own position is very simple, that Africans should be educated in their own languages. They should govern themselves in their own language. Every successful country in the world is like this, or at least a language which is very similar to theirs, such as Indonesian or Swahili, okay? But they should not be educated in a language which is totally alien to them. But then you have to say, well, look, you can't do this with every language. There's some languages in the world which only have a few thousand speakers. You can't expect people to go to college in a language if the language has only a few thousand speakers. Okay? So then, you then ask the question is, what is the limit? How small can a language be in terms of number of speakers, and you still want a policy that the people can go to school in their language their whole lives? You understand the question? Because it's unrealistic to do that if it's a very small number. So how do we decide? So I take a very empirical position. Let's look around the world and see what is the smallest number of speakers a language can have and still be used up to the highest levels. The answer is Icelandic. Icelandic, okay? You know Iceland, right? There's only 300,000 speakers of Icelandic. And yet, the universities in Iceland are in Icelandic. Not just the schools, okay? But Iceland is a little bit weird situation, okay? It's an island in the middle of the Atlantic. It's not connected to anything. They're sort of naturally separated from everything else, okay? So let's say, forget Iceland. Have it a country which is really surrounded by other countries and other languages. And the one which is the least is Estonia. Do you know Estonia? Okay, this is like next to Finland, okay? So Estonia, there's about 900,000 speakers, or a million maybe these days. Okay, and Estonian is used at every level. So let's say 1 million is a reasonable limit. So I would say a reasonable policy would be, if your language has 1 million speakers, the assumption should be that you will go to school in your language through university. Not everybody. If you want to go to English, it's possible, okay? But for the average person, the assumption should be that you will go do all of your schooling in your native language if it has more than 1 million. If it has less than 1 million, then that probably isn't realistic. So for people like that, probably you should only go to maybe 3rd grade, and then you switch to some other language which is more widely spoken. That's what I think a reasonable situation would be. Now, what if you're in a country in which there are many different languages spoken? What do you do then? Then what you do is you divide up the territory according to who speaks what language where. So if you did this in Indonesia, you would have, the Javanese would go to school in where most of the people are Javanese. The Balinese would go to the school where most people are Balinese. You would make some sort of a division. And this is what you do in Western countries, such as Switzerland is like this, Canada is like this, Belgium is like this, Finland is like this, Spain is like this. Actually, Britain is even getting to be like this, that you divide it up into different states, and in each state, they decide their language policy depending on who's living in the state. Also, India is like this, I should say. Okay? So that seems like a reasonable policy, and that is what I would suggest. So, why is this not being done? And I'm not doing anything weird. I'm simply saying, look, let's look at successful countries, and let's see what they do. You imitate that. Okay? So why is that not the case in Africa? So why is it that Africans support the idea that they should be educated in in European languages? One reason for this, and a very big reason, is that there's a belief that Africa is hopelessly multilingual. There are just too many languages. And in fact, even this is what was said, that Africa supposedly has 2,000 different languages. Supposedly.
2,000.
Supposedly. This is the narrative. Okay? So supposedly, because you have so many languages, you need some language to connect all of them, okay? So now, in fact, this is really a lie, okay? I mean, it's really an exaggeration. It's not true, okay? But let's look at how have they created the illusion that Africa has so many different languages. One way is, this is on the handout. First of all, borders are drawn so that the people who speak different languages will be on different sides of the border. And what that means is that in an individual African country, it will look as though you have a lot of languages, because the borders were drawn to divide between languages which are spoken in different countries. You get the idea? Another thing is, you draw borders so that as many languages as possible are inside the same border. In other words, you don't do what you do in Central Asia, you don't do what you do in Europe. In those countries, you draw the borders according to where people speak the language. In Africa, you just draw the borders, boom, 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 boom. And it turns out that naturally it makes it appear as though within the specific areas which you chose, there's a lot of different languages. Another tactic is, in many cases, the same language is given different names. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In other words, it's really the same language, but it's called different things in different places, so it gets counted as being different languages. This is very common. And I will give examples later. Another factor is that language data, I'm actually reading from the handout here, but I'm summarizing, okay? When they say how many languages are spoken, they give the same value to a language which has a few hundred speakers and a language which has millions of speakers. Okay? And obviously, as I said, if a language has only a few hundred speakers, it doesn't have to affect the national language policy. But if you group the languages which a huge number of speakers and a small number of speakers together, then it looks as though you have to accommodate all of these languages. And it's too many. Another factor is it is assumed that African countries will have centralized language policies. That, in other words, you will not divide up African countries into states, with each state having its own language policy. Switzerland, 26 different states, with only 6 million people, 26 different language policies. In fact, they have only 4 official languages there, but they will divide up the states according to that. African countries, with the exception of Ethiopia, assume that they will not divide up the country according to language. So these are reasons why it looks as though there's more. Now let us go to table 2. Please look on the handout here. So I'm just giving some examples. African languages with large populations living in contiguous territory separated by borders. We have Hausa. Hausa has 34 million speakers. You would think with 34 million speakers there should be a country called Hausaland. Okay? And the speakers all live in a contiguous area. Contiguous means it's all connected, okay? You would think. But in fact, Hausa land is divided up into several different countries, including 18.5 million Nigeria, 5.5 million Niger. Fula, 24 million, including 9.3 million Nigeria, 2.7 million Senegal, 1 million Mali. Here we have Bambara, Mandinka, and Dula. Now, actually, these are called three different languages, but actually it's the same language. 11 million speakers, including 3.4 million in Mali, 2.1 million in Guinea, 1.2 million in Burkina Faso, 1.1 million in Senegal, 0.5 million in Gambia. Nyanja, otherwise known as Chewa, 11.5 million, mostly in Malawi, but they have smaller populations in Zambia, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. Congo, 7 million, 3.5 million in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 1 million in Angola, 1 million in the Republic of the Congo. So if you look at these, for all of it, Fula is actually divided into two different groups. But all the rest of them, there is one contiguous area. You could make a Hausa land, a Bambara Mandinka Dula land, a Nyanja land, Congo land, whatever it is, and it would basically include almost only speakers of these languages. But instead, they have drawn borders dividing them up into different languages and in different places. Table 3, African countries with more than one relatively large language. Nigeria has Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo, each of which has 18 or so million speakers. Fula has 9.3 million. South Africa has Zulu with 10 million, Sotho with 8.3 million, Xhosa, which has 7.8 million. Democratic Republic has Chiluba with 7.8 million, and Kituba with 4.2 million. Now, as an example of how misleading these numbers are, I want to talk about a workshop which I led, at least this section of, in South Sudan, in March 2022. The purpose of the workshop was to translate textbooks into the 5 leading languages of South Sudan. Okay? So we were given English language textbooks, we had to translate them into the 5 leading languages. But was it really 5 languages? One of those languages was Dinka. Dinka is spoken by 4 million people, but you know what? There's no Dinka language. Officially, Dinka is 5 different languages. Dinka is officially Padang, Northwestern Dinka, Agar, Bor, and Rek. If you look on the Ethnologue, the list of languages in the world, there is no Dinka language. It is rather 5 languages. All of them can communicate with each other with no problem, but you know what? It's 5 languages. The second language, which we were supposed to work on, was Bari. But you know what? Bari is the same as Pojulu, Kakwa, Nyangwara, Kuku, and Mundari. They can all speak to each other very easily. But, you know what? It's counted as 6 languages.
What's that?
What?
What kind of word? Could you speak slowly a bit?
Okay, sorry. Okay. Bari was supposed to be one of the languages, okay? But it turned, we were translating textbooks. But it turns out that the Bari language is basically the same as the Pojulu language, and the Kakwa language, and the Kuku language, and the Nyangwara language, and the Mundari language. They can all speak to each other and communicate easily. But it is still considered to be 6 different languages. Next, we have Toposa. Toposa is very similar to Jia, which is spoken in South Sudan, Nyangatom, spoken in Ethiopia, Turkana, spoken in Kenya, and Karimajang, Dodos, and Jia, spoken in Uganda. So these are considered to be 7 different languages. But actually, there's no problem with them communicating with each other. Okay? And the other 2 are Nuer and Zande. And it seems as though Nuer and Zande really are just one language. So in other words, of the 5 languages, which everyone there assumed we were actually working on only 5 languages. It was obvious. But if you look on official lists, those 5 languages are actually 20 languages. Do you understand? So when you say there are 2,000 languages spoken in Africa, who knows? It's a fiction. They have people who speak each other, they understand each other easily, but for some reason, they call them different languages. Why do they do it this way in different areas? I don't know. For sure with Toposa, part of the reason is because the borders of Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, not Tanzania, Uganda and South Sudan, the borders are like this, and the one language is spoken in all four countries, because they drew the borders in a way to divide it up between 4 countries. So that's probably part of the reason they're considered to be 7 different languages. Probably, okay? But even within Ethiopia, Uganda, there's 3 different languages. So this is a very big issue, okay? This is a very big issue, that they are exaggerating the number of languages. And another factor which causes the same thing is the centralized government. So it is assumed that all of the education should be in the same language in the whole country. They don't want to divide it up into different states. In South Sudan, where I've worked a lot, the assumption is that there are 60 different languages and they need English to unite them. In fact, we have already seen that saying 60 different languages is not true. Secondly, if we have the NGOs I've worked with, we've made up a system about what they should do. If they divided up South Sudan into states and said that in each state they have their own policy, 75% of the people in the country could go to school in one of 6 languages. In other words, if they had 6 official languages, then 75% of the population could go to school in one of those 6 languages. And another 10% could go to school in a language which is very similar to theirs. There are 2 parts of South Sudan which have very scattered small populations. 2 of the 10 states, okay? But for 8 of the states, it's clear there's one particular ethnic group, one particular language group, and people should just go to school in that language. But that's not the discourse. The discourse is everyone has to go to school in the same language in the whole country. Okay, how much more time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up the rest of it. What can be done about the situation? Okay, you see what the problem is. The most important thing is that it does not help to work with governments. The governments do not want to help. Why? Because the governments are composed of people who have, the central governments are composed of people who have an interest in having only one language. As I have said in lectures in South Sudan, to be a leader in South Sudan, you can be a criminal, you can be a liar, you can be an adulterer, nobody cares. There's only one thing which you have to have, and you have to know English. That is the only requirement, okay, to be a leader, okay? So why would people like this say, you know what, we don't really need English, okay? We need the local language. Of course, the governments won't do anything. The second issue is the intellectuals also won't help. The intellectuals are obsessed with Pan-Africanism, the idea that we have to resist the imperialist foreigner invaders, and I have to take a plane to Cape Town or to Nairobi to talk with other Pan-Africanists, and we will have our conferences in English or French or whatever, and we will decry the evil. Okay, so the first 2 years I was working with Africans, I thought, well, these people want to help. You know, they are intellectuals, and they were like, oh, John, this is a great project. This is wonderful. You have to work on this. And you know what? They didn't contact me again, okay? And I realized after a while, they don't know how to write their own languages. They know how to write English and French very well, but they don't know their own languages. So what do you do? I want to end in a little bit more positive note. So what does seem to be the way to go to some extent is to work with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, of indigenous people, not foreign aid organizations. The United Nations has no interest in this. Bill Gates has absolutely no interest in this. All they want is English, 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 or French, French, French. But there are local NGOs who do this. What have we been doing? For example, Wikipedia. Do you know Wikipedia? Okay, so 35 African languages have Wikipedias, And this Wikipedia at least shows people that you can read and write the native languages. Because this is a big problem. They don't even think that you can write about chemistry or history or political science, anything in their own language. But if you have a Wikipedia, then it's proof. You can show them because they have this psychology that you can't do this. So we have started a Dinka Wikipedia, and I am now working on a 4 Wikipedia. So Dinka Wikipedia is the 35th in an African language, and the first in a Nilotic language. 4, this is spoken in Sudan, will be the 36th when we start it. That's one thing. Another thing is Facebook groups. Okay, so Facebook is a way, you guys know Facebook? Do they know Facebook? Yeah. Okay, you know Facebook. No, in Japan people don't know Facebook. Really? A lot of people don't. So we have a Dinka Facebook group, which has 43,000 members. And in this group, you write in Dinka. And we started it in 2016. For the first 2 years, they didn't understand. And now they understand. Now they understand that's a place you can go to, and you can write in Dinka, and people will answer you, okay? And so it gets at least the thinking into their head that you can actually do something like this, okay? There are various other examples. I don't want to get into this too much. I think I better wrap this up fast. So I definitely won't say anything about Tanzania, but we'll talk about Tanzania later. Okay, there isn't too much else I wanted to do. Last thing, okay, 2 very short things. There are 2 nation states in Africa which they drew the borders well, okay, that I know of. One is Rwanda, and another one is Botswana. Okay? And those are countries where there's almost only one linguistic group. And in those languages, I was in Rwanda a few years ago, and as far as I understand, they mostly have schooling in Kinyarwanda until 6th grade. And my understanding is in Botswana means the land of the Tswana people. Almost 90% of the population speaks Tswana, and they do use Tswana in education, I understand, up to 6th grade, okay? So there are African countries, but I don't have much experience in those countries. In those countries, they accidentally happened to draw good borders. They made a mess in other ways in Rwanda, but at least linguistically they drew good borders. So there are places where something like this can happen. The last quick point I want to make is that recently in some countries in West Africa, in Mali and Niger, they started really getting anti-French sentiment, okay? And Mali declared that French is no longer an official language. This only happened like the last month or 2. And Niger, they had some revolution there, and they kicked out the French, and they won't let the French army come in, and there's a lot of anti-French feeling in West Africa these days. And this could eventually have some sort of effect in terms of language policy. Eventually, the local languages are going to win, okay? Because this is how history works. It may take hundreds of years, but you bring in foreign languages, they try to impose the foreign language, eventually the local people win out. Many of the local languages will disappear, but some of them will survive. But it's going to take a really long time, and it's going to be a long struggle. So that's it, okay. Sorry I went over, I know.
That's fine. Let's give big applause to Professor Myhill's presentation.
And I'm really interested in hearing about Tanzania, because I don't know very much. Okay. There was a tourist for 1 week.
Yeah. Please hold your questions until we finish with the second presenter. Yeah? But in the meantime, you can start writing a question, both in the chat box or on your own notes. Now we are going to have our second presenter today, Professor Dephine Kessy. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Good morning. It is 4 hours different between Jogja and Tanzania. So in Tanzania now is 7 a.m. 7 a.m. That's correct. Yeah. So you had to wake up really early this morning, aren't you?
In fact, your message is the one which awakened me up.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry for this. And then I had to rush quickly, wash my face and appear here on the screen. I'm
Okay.
in my room actually.
All right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So our second speaker today is Professor Dephine Kessy, as I have mentioned earlier. She is a lecturer from St. Augustine University of Tanzania. Professor Kessy, the floor is yours for 45 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor Paulus. I do not know whether I correctly pronounced your name, but we are always different when it comes into languages, and probably because of my Kiswahili, I cannot speak, your language very well, but I know, for example, Sarwoto should be Sarwoto because of the relationship between Swahili and Bahasa Indonesia. So, good morning again, each and every one of us. I'm happy to join you on this Zoom meeting to give you just a few view of how I understood this topic. I will share my screen, and I believe you will see it. Let's share the screen. Yeah. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
please?
very clearly.
Right. Okay, thank you. So this is our topic, and I'm blessed to serve in the Directorate of Research, Innovation, and Community Engagement at St. Augustine's University. But my profession is in tourism, so I teach tourism, or rather, I'm even more I understand a lot more about tourism, but not languages as the first presenter is, but at least I'll give what I know about our continent with regard to languages and colonial policies in Africa. So when I was trying to think about this very, very, this topic generally, I realized we have to at least take our focus this way, like how languages have been affected by policies, but again, how these policies have been affected by languages during and probably after colonial period in Africa. But one very provoking question that might come to the minds of many is to ask themselves whether Africa is really independent or not. So it is a mix of different ideas or concepts. So then I realized in the context of thinking that we really had very profound effects on the linguistic landscapes during the colonization, during the colonialism, but that was not the case before colonialism. So to understand this question very well, I thought probably we should look at these two different maps of Africa. This one before colonialism, and this is Africa after colonialism. So we had Africa of this nature. It was thought to be like one country, and therefore we had different languages, of course, but with high interaction. So the Africa of 1880 had only main 4 languages which were spoken, and they were all lingua francas. The linguistic professor understand better what is lingua franca is. In other words, it's a language that borrows from the other language, and you are able to communicate even though it's not your indigenous or traditional language. So this part of Africa or almost the whole continent of Africa was having Bantu language, and of course it originated from Congo, and therefore it is called the Niger Congo. But this other part of Africa, we had Nilo-Saharan, and this part we had Afro-Asiatic. This is the eastern part of Africa, and the southern part of Africa we had Khoisan. So, however, when colonialism began, of course, let's see what happened before colonialism. How did these languages affected the African societies before colonial time? We understand that Africa is, is not as it is, or as it was, and as it was referred to as one country before colonialism. It's a huge continent, only next to Asia. However, it has a diverse environment, from dry desert to dense rainfall. And, the land is also very arable. If you look at this map, you will know that in Africa, people can do farming. They kept livestock. Some people did trade especially from this part of Africa. And others, they used their mineral resources for development. So languages had all these effects before the arrival of colonialists. The societies interacted with one another through commerce, marriages, migration, diplomacy, sometimes warfare, but because of land, trade routes, and of course, because of keeping cattle, people were forced to interact. For example, in East Africa, in terms of business, they were connected to the Chinese. East Africa, this part of Africa, we are connected to Chinese and Middle Eastern and Indian traders, and Portugal established a limna in the modern Ghana, this part of Africa, modern Ghana. So in the end, and of course, it was in the 15th century before colonialism. So commerce was instrumental in the state formation, and of course, trade offers, they offered the ability to exchange local surpluses for rare foods and goods across Saharan desert. And in terms of languages, Africa had using these four major groups of languages, Africa could interact, could understand each other. But there was a little problem, because for them, they didn't prefer written languages. They were used to oral languages. They could not write their languages. So it was difficult to keep, any information. So even though it was like that, we know that the world's greatest civilization began in Africa. We understand the use of iron tools to enhance weaponry, to clear land for farming, and have better lives in large communities, which later formed states and kingdoms. And these states and kingdoms, resulted to the modern civilization, of course, in African context of that time. And of course, common languages, beliefs, values, and system. They also had art, religious, lifestyle, and culture. So because they preferred oral tradition rather than written, I think that thing made many people, including colonialists themselves, to think that Africa was uncivilized. However, we had, the western part of Africa, there was a group already which could use, which could write, and part of Egypt as well. So these are the Hausa people, I think it's Hausa or Yoruba, and they would write what is called Ajami. So anyway, so the problem arose because once an oral thing is being told several times, it loses its meaning. But however, in Africa, if I were to summarize, Africa had civilized states like Egypt, Nubia, Ghana, Mali, and Zimbabwe. But again, we know that if I refer to Egypt, for example, it was until 3200 before Common Era, Egyptian society was complex. From building the massive pyramids that you see today, to the development of complex written languages, to the creation of plows, which were used to clear lands for farming. Again, it was until after 700 Common Era sub-Saharan African empires could emerge and exist for longer period of time. Also, for, I don't know, for different reasons, maybe due to lack of concrete technology, these greatest African empires failed and ultimately fell apart by being replaced by one another. For example, we see Mali succeeding Ghana and Songhai following Mali Empire. Regardless, each empire improved upon the social, political, commercial, and military organizations, especially after they were established by their predecessors, and of course in various ways. This happened in the part of Western Africa. Then I said, if that was the Africa before colonialism, what happened? What happened after? Anyway, these are even more other examples of how languages have affected the African society. I mean, the interactions which was taking place, for example, by a thousand Common Era states and civilization emerged and thrived throughout the continent. And those societies varied in structure, and they had evolved to suit local environment, political, and even social situations. In South Africa, for example, the people of the modern day Zimbabwe and Zambia, they were able to exploit their mineral resources, at least to do trade, to do trade with their neighbors. However, they also put up permanent stone structures and houses in the whole parts of Africa wherever they were needed. So for example, the Great Zimbabwe of that time was established in 1250 Common Era. So before colonialism, there existed 10,000 states and kingdoms in Africa. So this, I don't know, but after the arrival of colonialism, this is what happened. Africa that could communicate with each other, even though with not a common language, say maybe, for example, Niger Congo, which is basically Bantu, that was used by almost everybody in the continent. The Europeans, when they arrived, could not acquire fluency in any of these indigenous or ethnic languages, the way they call it. So you would find traders and missionaries, for example. You know, this is my thinking, that they might have stayed in one place for longer time than officers representing the government, for example. And similarities, of course, among all the banned languages, simplified learning of some African languages, you know, or assisted them to communicate with the people that they found within the continent. And because they had a common purpose, they knew what they were looking for. They could learn the language and started to impose their own languages or impose their own words little by little. So it is also my thinking that whites, you know, for example, accept missionaries, and it is found in the literature as well in Central Africa, perhaps, did not concern themselves with the vernaculars if they could use the lingua francas, for example, such as Bantu. So they had no concern to see or to understand the languages the Africans could speak. Rather, they only thought, you know, to achieve the mission that they had. And we all know the mission was to get raw materials for their industries because they were already advanced, they were already developed than Africans themselves. So this is the imposition of the colonial languages in African continent. Remember, I told you from the other, slide from here that Africa was once like this, but after colonialism, it is like this. And all these places, you know, these are the, for example, it's just a map of mineral resources that are in Africa. And the aim of colonialists was to look for these mineral resources, to look for any raw materials, whether from farms, sisal, etc. We know from West Africa, they got, I don't know, ivory, they got, you know, lots of things for their developed or for their industrialization in Western Europe. So this is the imposition because now they had, you know, something that they wanted to achieve. They had to force Africans. Definitely, Africans were forced to change their languages so that they would understand the languages of their colonial masters, so that they would serve the purpose of the colonial masters. So in terms of the division now that took place, we can see Africa with different language like this. Tanzania itself, you know, we were having 4 different colonizers from Arabians to Portuguese to Germans to English. And for us, I think for a country like Tanzania, people got even more confused which language they would use in contact with the Asians, with Arabic, and that is why even Swahili itself remains to be a lingua franca because, sorry, can you get me or hello?
Yeah, we get you.
Thank you. So even Kiswahili itself remains to be a lingua franca. I think like Indonesia, you know, there's not much different because I've tried to see Indonesians and the comparison between Kiswahili and Indonesia. So it has remained a lingua franca, and just because we had 4 different colonizers, but again, people, you know, as we inherited from Bantu, you know, continued to understand continued to understand each other using their traditional languages as you compare to the languages that were imposed to us. And this was advantageous to the colonialists because they were able to perpetuate their concepts, their ideas of getting what surely they had. And therefore, Africans, the Africa that we know that it was at least advanced, and only because probably of technology that we were not as advanced as other countries of the time, now the development that was even existing is falling apart because nobody understood each other anymore. And because of the force of the use of the colonial language, I think it brought confusion to our forefathers until, like, now you are saving something else. You are not operating in the structures that you established. So obvious, there would be many other things that would take place and take you away from your original purpose, or from, life would have changed completely. This is what I think. So that imposition itself claimed that Africa was unsettled, and therefore it resulted into many things like petitioning, but also forcing these African states, the states which were already formed, to understand the colonial languages for the benefit of colonialism itself. However, as I said already, lingua francas such as Bantu facilitated the process because the colonial masters could easily penetrate as they imposed their languages little by little. So empires definitely lost their languages, and eventually cultural transformation took place. And that was the genesis of Africa to become poor. It is thought that colonialism policies would not have worked without suppressing the cultures that existed before. So colonialists, for example, educated Africans to believe on their own inferiority, to tell somebody you are not civilized, only from the perspective that you yourself understand. I think it was something that was torturing. It removed confidence from Africans themselves. And of course, that could be added with, because they had not traveled to other parts of the world to see what was happening. So in the end, they had to believe, they had to receive it, but probably it was not for their, they were not happy of it, but what could they do? So today, African countries, I have seen that, as the professor said, African countries adopted colonial languages as their language. Even though they still speak their own languages, the traditional languages, and the colonial languages comes the second or the third. But these languages are being adopted in like official languages, state languages. Even though, for example, in Tanzania, Kiswahili is the national language, and of course from 1958, and Kiswahili addressed the Parliament of Tanzania, for example, in 1963, after it was declared by the first president that it is the national language. We don't see it, working very well for us, because the languages which were introduced in schools were not traditional languages like Kiswahili. Remember when these colonialists came, and because they had no interest in developing Africans to govern themselves, there was no clear policy on education. So the education that was in place was to assist, the goals of colonialists. And in the end, the language that was used was also the language of the colonialists. So Kiswahili didn't get a chance to even get a translation of an English book during that time into Kiswahili so that people would learn in Kiswahili. It was a difficult time. If I read from history, that even the first president faced a very difficult time because he also had, less people who were educated and therefore take the country forward. So it is, for example, estimated that there's 68% of new French speakers of new French speakers in Africa, and this makes, or not, it doesn't necessarily mean only people from Africa to making the French language to be the 5th spoken language in the world. Kiswahili is only the 10th language that is spoken in the world. It is having around 3 million people speak. 3 million speakers. So the 20th century independence of many world nations, especially in Africa, was anyway brought by the colonial language, and this is English. So English has become a global language. You know, these are the times that we should not undermine, you know, the importance of these languages, because they're still making people to talk, to communicate. I now speak to you in English, and you understand me because of English, and that is why we call it a global language. But however, to understand English should not make me not to understand my own language. And of course, these languages, the colonial languages, major setback that was brought by them is that when you are learning a new language, you don't get things so easily. So even to become innovative, even to think, to plan for your own development becomes more difficult. Now, I said, what will be the future of languages in Africa? I have realized that because we have language inequalities, Africans definitely, as the professor said, we neither understand our colonial master's language nor what is called the vernacular language for ourselves. I don't understand Kiswahili very well by myself, even though also I don't speak a better or a good English by myself. Because I learned, for example, from primary school, with 7 years, I learned from school in Kiswahili, with the national language, with the exception of English, which was taught as a subject. I'm sorry, I'm told my internet is very low. I don't know whether you are getting me or not. I have to do something.
We lost you a while, but now we get you back. No worries.
Oh, you got me back. Thank you so much. So this is my situation now, that, for example, I learned using Kiswahili from primary 1 to primary 7. And then from there, when I went to a secondary school, which was basically for 6 years, I started to learn using English throughout, with the exception of Kiswahili itself, if I was a Kiswahili major then. But primary 1 to primary 7 was Kiswahili, with the exception of English itself. And the English, I could not say even hello. I wouldn't write the word together, for example. And that is the situation. So instead of working together as Africans, because of the imposition of the colonial languages, Africa works in fragmented order, especially after believing, after when the belief in ourselves was deprived, being told we are uncivilized, being told that the language that you're using is not the language of the world. We did not get any encouragement of any way. So independent African nations are economically not independent, and no any policy that was set for their favor after colonialism. We only received the political independence. These other things, it's a struggle of a country. And of course, remember, we were partitions, like the borders were introduced for easy ruling of the country itself and to perpetuate the goals of these colonialists. So there's no clear strategy for common language development that was put. Even if you go state after the other, even if you go to Germany, colonize the country, there was no, a strategy that was put to develop either German itself or an indigenous language that was used before the colonialism itself. So today, colonial languages is used in businesses. It's almost everywhere. So it is difficult for Africa, or maybe we are late already to go back and start thinking of these traditional languages, even though we still need them because they should not get lost. It is the first language that our people speak. So Africa is not only dependent on Western European languages, but also in different development policies. Being undermined from both languages and understanding by being called uncivilized societies, they are not involved in major decision making. In Africa, if you don't, as Professor said it already, that if you don't understand English, it's likely that you don't have any capability of doing anything. So major decisions such as the world order that was put in 1945, for example, by the US and Western countries, did not involve any African country. How can we develop if we were left behind like this? We have remained rule receivers, sometimes because of languages itself. And of course, colonial languages have remained a test of individuals' capability while we still remain supplying raw materials to our colonial masters. Again, we see different efforts, of course, given by Africans, and I want to refer to this conference, which was called in 1955 by President Suharto, if I remember correctly. Because from 1945 to 1960s, this is when many of these, what they called undeveloped countries were getting their independence. After they realized that they were left behind in making major decisions that's like the 1945 world order, these countries came together, Asians and Africans, so that at least they would reclaim back, what was put and what they thought was not good for them. At least they were asking for many things, like maybe right to technological transfer, so that they could also get somewhere, be considered for major decisions, etc. Anyway, to understand the language of the world should be a source of peace, as I get it. I'm going to conclusions, and I am saying languages should assist African countries have peace, because so far, I think it is also because we don't understand each other. We hear war from country to the other, and sometimes using same weapons, same way the colonialist thought before. It is still the same way that we are being used to hate each other. Hatred was using different language. I don't understand what Malian are speaking, Liberian, Kiswahili, they don't get me well. Through that way, people are not at peace at all. So in the end, we don't understand each other, there's no peace and there's no development. I remember, the saying of the Pope Paul VI, which said peace is a result, or it should be a new word. It should be a new word for development and the likes. So the future of languages, again, I say there's no need to force an individual to understand a colonial master's language, no marginalization of indigenous language. What matters is capability. If somebody is able to deliver, if I understand my language and I can invent, for example, why should I not be accepted, but I wait and, I am forced to tell it in the language that I don't get it completely. So indigenous languages that were marginalized or suppressed during colonialism may be reintroduced into education, media, and public life as way of reclaiming cultural identity. This is not the case in Tanzania, for example. I have heard now people are thinking of introducing, for example, English from primary school. And of course, it is because people are seeking for opportunities, are looking to whether they can be employed or they can be, we are not thinking so much into being creative because even the real world that we are living, we don't understand it well. So we remain to be dependent to our colonial masters. I don't know until when, but I think if our language would be reintroduced into the education system and people be taught in a language such as Kiswahili, that one would assist people to be more innovative and they can invent and at least we can start to depend on ourselves. A first language that it will assist an individual to understand the world and interpret it easily. And in Africa, for example, because Kiswahili is a lingua franca, probably they might decide, and of course it was adopted by the African Union to become, a language of Africa. And we also it was appreciated by the United Nations as, as an official language of the United Nations. So probably this language could be used in African continent to other countries in the continent and start to unite Africa itself. Again, I say it in conclusions, Africa remains a multilingual continent. Post-colonial nations often have multiple languages in use, reflecting the linguistic diversity of their population. Again, the influence of globalization has led to the increase of the use of international languages such as French and English in business, media, and diplomacy. There's no way we can avoid using English, for example, because, how can we communicate? If we start to build our own Kiswahili, I can imagine how long shall it take to teach the whole world in Kiswahili, and therefore start to do things like those which have been done by English in the world. However, we should not leave it, as I have kept repeating it. So balancing the demands of global communication with the preservation of indigenous language remains a challenge, however. We have to see how better we can preserve the indigenous languages. We should also look at how we can encourage our own communities, our own societies, our people to use the indigenous languages apart from learning the colonial masters' languages. And colonial languages suppression still exists, and and of course forge international control over resources, unfair condition of trade and finances. We see maybe what's happening in Mali today is because the MOUs or whatever they had entered, or maybe in Niger, what the forefathers signed was because they didn't understand the language very well. Because how is it possible, for example, for a country which is called an independent country pay taxi to its colonial master, for example? You continue to pay taxi, you continue to do this, How possible is that? So this is my view, and I thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you very much, and let's give big applause to Professor Dephine Kessy. Very amazing presentation from both presenters, Professor Myhill and the native informant, Professor Dephine Kessy, with, of course, her first-hand experience of living in a post-colonial state in Africa. Yeah. Similar cases probably also we can observe in Indonesian case, like Like in my case, my first language is Javanese, my second language is Indonesian, and my third language is English. But nowadays, people started to forget Javanese, especially in the newer generation. So they start off directly with Indonesian or even English since elementary school, right? And African lesson or African experience, I think, can help us to reflect on the future direction, of course, of our language policy in a smaller context in our family, maybe, yeah. Okay, but we now come to the question and answer session. We still have about 30 minutes, yeah. And I would like to invite the audience present in this room to address a question, first by, of course, raising your hand. Yeah. And for those joining us via Zoom, feel free to type your questions via the chat box. Yeah. So I will invite questions, one from my right. Yeah, probably one more students. Oh, sorry, not all of you are students, yeah. One from my right, probably one from the middle. Okay, one from the middle, sure. Could you please introduce your name, where you're from, and then to whom your question is addressed?
Okay, my name is William from Tanzania. I would like to ask this question. Like from the both presentation, are they explained about the language from the post-colonial and now? So my question will be, what should the Africa do now? Should they focus on developing the traditional languages in their own country, or should they focus on developing African one common language for the peace, unit, and harmony, and for business purposes?
Right. And then second question.
Hello. Thank you for this. My name is Nade, and I was born in Senegal, Dakar, but raised in the U.S. since I was young. And my question is kind of twofold. So one is in reference to the 10% literacy you mentioned in Africa, and wondering if that was about...
No, I said South Sudan.
Oh, in South Sudan.
But it's pretty low in the rest of Africa. I know South Sudan. I don't know other countries, but I'm sure it's very low.
Is that in reference to the colonial language or the indigenous language?
Any.
Okay, interesting. And my second question...
Almost no one can read or write in Africa, other than Swahili. Almost nobody can read or write an indigenous African, and Ethiopia, I'm not talking about that. But in the rest of Africa, almost nobody can read and write an indigenous language
Right. Yeah.
at really like an adult level. Almost nobody.
Oh yeah, in the indigenous...
So it's only the colonial language.
Got it,
more
yeah.
or less, yeah.
That makes sense and matches up with like my experience going to school in Africa when I was younger. It was in French education, and then Wolof is just like oral and informal language. So I guess my second question is about how we can find solutions that are not rooted in like Western standards, but like Professor Kessy mentioned, the oral legacy of Africa is just like to speak orally. So how do we root solutions in that, and at the same time not undermining colonial languages?
Thank you very much. Two very important and heavy questions coming from Tanzania and from Senegal, is it? Yeah, right. Addressed both to Professor Dephine Kessy and Professor Myhill, right? So probably you would like to start, Professor Myhill, answering the question first, and then we go to Professor Dephine Kessy? Okay, please.
First of all, with respect to your question, it doesn't make any sense to try to have one African language. There's too much diversity in Africa. It doesn't make sense. It may be that in certain local contexts, you can have a language which will unify a bunch of languages which are similar to each other. So I don't know very much about Tanzania, but it seems as though from what little I do know, the languages in Tanzania are pretty similar to each other in being Bantu languages, except for Maasai, which is Nilo-Saharan, obviously. But they're generally similar to each other, so it may be that in that case, having Swahili to unite a bunch of languages which are similar to each other and to Swahili can work. Generally similar to what's being done with Bahasa Indonesia here, okay? But to try I mean, for example, in Kenya, they attempted to use Swahili as a national language, but Kenya is divided between people who speak Nilo-Saharan languages, like Kalenjin and Turkana, and you have a lot of Somalis in the country also who speak Afro-Asiatic languages. And these languages have nothing to do with each other. And those Afro-Asiatic languages, Nilo-Saharan languages, and Bantu languages have no relationship to each other. So to try to get everybody in this, Swahili is a completely foreign language to someone who speaks Kalenjin or something like this. So it makes no sense to try to impose that language on people who speak a completely unrelated language. So one language for all of Africa is crazy, okay? And it will just mean Swahili speakers will be trying to conquer other people. Okay, so that will not work. But it may be within certain local contexts, it would work. For example, in South Africa, my understanding is that Zulu, Xhosa, and what's this called, Shona, are not so different from each other. So maybe you could have something which combines all of them. I don't know. I know that in South Sudan, it will not work to combine one language. Okay, for sure it won't work. All right, but it may be that in other contexts you can do something like that. That's possible. Okay. But one for the whole continent is crazy. Now, so your question was about, first of all, it is not going to work to rely on oral languages, okay? The modern world, you have to have written languages. If you say, we will develop African languages as oral languages, but we will use European languages as written languages, what it means is that you are just throwing African languages into the garbage. Okay? I hate to say this, but this is the reality. So you have to develop written languages. If you want to, I mean, so far the strategy has been, we will write European languages and speak African languages, and you can see the result is disaster. So this has been going on for 100 years. It has always been disaster. It's not getting any better. So I don't think that this is a good strategy. What Africans can do, and what I think they should do, is they should, my position is, I think I said it pretty clearly, people should be educated in their language up through university, okay? If the language has at least 1 million speakers. Now, it may be that there are some cases where there are languages which are similar enough to their native languages, such as Swahili. Like, for example, what is your native language? What?
My native language is Hehe, for Southern.
Hehe? Hehe, okay.
H-E-H-E.
Hehe.
Hehe.
So Hehe, is that very similar to Swahili? It's pretty similar, okay? So maybe for someone like you, it is okay if instead of using Hehe in school, you use Swahili from a very early age, if it's similar enough to try to combine. So you need to look at each individual case. If it is a language which only has 5,000 speakers and it is different from every other language, then you need to say, okay, I guess we will be educated in another language. If it is a language which has, if it's like Hausa or something like this, then you use it in your whole life. It is Hehe, maybe you decide, we have a certain number of speakers, but maybe it is better to use Swahili because it is easy for us. Okay? So you can't have one policy for everywhere. You need to figure out which languages you want to develop, and you need to focus on them. And the others are probably going to disappear at some point in the future. But if you try to focus on every language, you won't get anywhere. You need to decide which languages you focus on, which language you don't focus on, and you need to develop them as written language. And written language does not only mean a Bible translation. Because what the British did in particular is they were good in terms of they gave you a Bible translation and you could read and write in that. But they did nothing else. So you have to be able to use it for everything. that's basically I mean, you need to focus on your own languages and decide which ones you want to focus on. That's
Okay.
my position.
Thank you. Professor Dephine?
Thank you so much. I'm not very far from him, but I think now that, for example, Africa is as it is, we have different languages, from from French, from Portuguese, from Germany, English, ourselves, we don't understand each other. So in the end, I thought, for example, each country, as he puts it, that they can see how they can create different languages. I mean, their own languages, of course, educational languages, but we need to have one common language that should unite us as Africans. A language which is having 300 million speakers, a population of Indonesia, for example, you don't understand each other and you are in Indonesia, and, it's really difficult. So we have to, whether we like it or not, we can read, we can write in our own languages, but we at least need to have one common language that should unite us. And because of course, Africa, for now, we are on the same situation. We are not developed, in terms of technology, in terms of anything. So we need at least to tell each other that at least we have to make some steps, some differences in our own countries. Anyway, in terms of country, we also differ, but at least we have to have a common language that should unite us as Africans because of the differences that are existing and, of course, which are a result of colonialism. That's number one. Number two, whether we have to use oral languages, I clearly got what Professor said. He said we should be writing, because what brought us problems as Africans is because we used to only prefer oral, oral literature, which could not go anywhere. Because as I'm communicating today, tomorrow if you take my communications, if you take my message to somebody else, the meaning might be different. Of course, the general meaning might remain the same, but the words will never remain the same. So we need to emphasize people to be writing. This is how I take it. Thank you.
Right. Okay. And there is, I think, one more question about how to navigate the balance between, on the one hand, learning one's own language, but on the other, we have also to study this international language if you want to communicate with the international community. I remember at one point, Ngugi wa Thiong'o criticized and also even suggested the abolishment of the English department in Africa because it is the language of the colonizer. And also he started to write in Swahili. But once he wrote in Swahili, nobody read his novels, and then he returned to write in English again. So how would really to keep the balance? Yeah, just to pick up from the last question that's addressed. Okay. Professor Dephine and Professor Myhill, probably you can respond to this question.
For me, it's not a problem. We are advanced a little bit from the times when Ngugi wa Thiong'o was writing the literatures. That's number one. But again, the world is changing so fast. And I remember I said, language like English, we cannot avoid it. We need it. But however, also, Africa, as Africa, has to have its own language. Because, in other words, we are looking at a point where, because Africans cannot communicate to each other, this is one problem. Somebody is speaking French, another one from Angola speaks Portuguese, and Mozambique, anyway. And somebody from Namibia speaks Germany, you see. Even if we have a common thing to argue at the world stage, we don't have a common understanding. This is what I mean. So in the end, we need to have a language that will unite Africans, even though we have our own policies that guide us on how we can educate our own societies. And in the end, after we understand each other, we can now use this English to tell the world what we think. So we need both. Kiswahili is, or if they would choose Kiswahili anyway, they can think of another language, but I'm talking of Kiswahili because I know it is the largest spoken, it has the largest population here in Africa already, more than 300 million speakers. And by the way, in Africa, we have more than 800 languages spoken across the country, if you live along the 4 major families of languages that I said. So in the end, if we don't have a common language that can take us to the world, it's likely that we are still going to be dependent, and of course, this divide and rule system will continue forever. We have to get a point where we can unite and take our problems to the front together. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Professor Myhill, yes.
Professor, what is her name?
Dephine Kessy.
What Professor Kessy is suggesting is basically replacing English and French colonialism with Swahili colonialism. Okay, you'll notice that she is using exactly the same arguments. Instead of uniting behind English or French, we have to unite behind Swahili. So I have worked in Nilo-Saharan languages. Nilo-Saharan languages, there are maybe 150 million speakers. Nilo-Saharan languages such as Dinka, Kanuri, Kalenjin, they are as different from Swahili as English is. They have nothing in common. Nothing. Okay? If you speak a Swahili sentence in South Sudan, no one will understand a single word. I'm not exaggerating. No matter what language they speak, if they don't speak Swahili, maybe if they speak Arabic as a second language, they will recognize that they will recognize a word here and there. No one will understand it. In Senegal, I'm quite certain that if you spoke Swahili, no one would understand a single word. In 90% of Africa, if you attempt to speak Swahili, I shouldn't say 90%, maybe, if the Bantu-speaking area, maybe some people will understand something. Africa is just a concept. It is a continent. To try to say that all of Africa should have one language, and it should be Swahili or Hausa or Yoruba, it's just as bad. It's not quite as bad, but it's also very bad. You need, but on the other hand, maybe Swahili should be used. For one idea, for example, divide Kenya into 3 countries. Take Western Kenya and put it together with Uganda. Take northeastern Kenya and put it together with Somalia, and the rest of Kenya, maybe they can use Swahili because they really speak Bantu languages there. Maybe there it's appropriate. Maybe Mozambique. I don't know. But all of West Africa, forget it. North Africa, forget it. Ethiopia, forget it. It's just replacing one kind of colonialism with another kind of colonialism. So to answer your question, it depends upon the individual case. You really need to look at the individual case in the individual country and see which languages do we have here, which ones should we develop, which ones should we not develop. There's no simple answer to that. So I can say, but I would like to address the idea that that you mentioned an author who wrote in Swahili and then didn't have an audience.
Okay.
Any time you begin writing in a language, you are not going to have an audience. The first things which were written in English, Beowulf, whatever it was written, when Old English was written, the number of people who could read the things that were written, I don't think that there were even 100 people. Okay? So if you want to write a language and be the first person to write in a language, you should understand you are not going to have a big audience. You do it because you love it and you love your language. And if it's more important for you to make a lot of money and to have a huge readership, fine. But then your language is going to die because everyone is going to think that same way. No language is ever developed except by people who just believe in their language. That's what they have to do, not to make money, not to say we are going to unite the universe. It's people who love their language. That's what it is. So what does that mean? The individual person has to make the decision. You made a decision how much you want to use English, how much you want to use Indonesian, how much you want to use Javanese. Every person has to make their own decision, and at a certain stage, every society has to make their own decision. But I can't give one answer. It doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Yeah, so apparently we have two different opinions from these two speakers. So
About Swahili, but the her second point I agree with completely.
Yeah, but I think the idea of you know, the importance of having one language that is understood across Africa is an idea.
Of course, and you can use English also. English can be used across Africa.
Yeah, but the problem is some areas they only speak German and Portuguese and French.
And the same thing with Swahili. You can't take Swahili, you can't take Hausa.
I know, exactly. So
if you could just take everybody out of Africa, if you could move 500,000 Chinese people into Africa and it would solve the problem.
Yeah, right? But it doesn't mean that the conversation has to stop. Yeah?
It's not going to work to have one language.
You need to keep it open in probably seminars, dialogues, or talk like this. Do not too soon to conclude with a conclusion before actually you have enough deliberation among yourself. Yeah, right. I would like to open the second session for question and answer session. Anybody from my front? No? Again? Okay. Yes, please.
Before I ask a question, I would like to say a little bit, based on the response from our presenters. I like what Professor Dephine explained, because it's like this. What we are trying to do is to solve the problem, what we have right now. So, for example, if you trace on the before colonial era, as we said that Africa it was like one country. You see, so that means they had their own way of living, and then when the colonial came, they imposed the language to communicate. So it was possible, but why now it cannot be possible to choose one language as African to communicate? Yeah. Why it was possible for English, but not one language for African for Africa? Because it is a matter of decision. When African comes together, then they say, okay, let's choose one language. Everyone agrees. Let's say for business purpose, we choose this language. For example, today we have, let's say, European Union. What language do they speak mostly? English. You have now BRICS. What language do they speak mostly? English. You see? So it was possible. Why it was possible for colonial era, and now it's not possible for Africans to choose their own language? So it is a matter of decision. If Africans say, yes, we want, it can be possible. Yeah. Yes, we're talking about less. Like Kenya, they have their own language. Yes, they have. Other countries, they have their own language. Yes, but when they decide to say, okay, for this language, we want to decide this for communication purpose, maybe for the business, it can be possible. Yeah. Now, my question, according to observation, why do you think, according to you, why do you think it is possible for Africa now to decide?
First of all, it is not true that there was one united Africa before colonialism or ever. They were radically divided. Forget about language. It is nonsense to say there are 800 languages in Africa, but it is not nonsense to say there are 150 languages in Africa. Second of all, at another point in her presentation, my colleague from Tanzania said there were 10,000 states in Africa before colonization. On the one hand, she said Africa was united. On the other hand, she said there were 10,000 states. Do you remember she said that? What is the truth? They're both complete nonsense. It was somewhere in between. Africa has never been united. For that matter, Europe has never been united. The divisions in Africa, some of them were brought by colonialists, but some of them were not brought by colonialists. There are divisions there. The divisions, I think that you don't know anything but Swahili. You don't know Yoruba, you don't know Wolof, you don't know Amharic, you don't know any of the Nilotic languages. And you somehow have the differences between the European languages, if you exclude Hungarian, Basque, Finnish and Estonian, the differences between all of the rest of the European languages are really not that great. There is more difference even within Niger-Congo, let alone the other 3 language families, than there is. Europe is more united linguistically than Africa is. There's no comparison between them. You go out, you try to learn Yoruba, you try to learn Wolof, you try to learn Amharic, you try to learn Dinka. Do that for a few years, and then you tell me that these languages are really similar and Africans are similar. You go and live in different countries in Africa, and you see how different the customs are, the religions are. Even within South Sudan, people can't agree on very many basic cultural things. You have this fantasy in your mind that all of Africa is one, and the reason is that you don't know about Africa. I don't know about Africa either, but I do know that it's not one. It's very radically divided, and it's not because of the colonials. Some of it is because of the colonials, but it's not only because of the colonials. Additionally, you are a Tanzanian. You think that, look, we adopted Swahili. Everyone can adopt Swahili. Tanzania is not even 5% of the population of Africa. You try to go to people in the rest of Africa and get them to accept. Idi Amin, that was Idi Amin, do you know guys who know who Idi Amin was? He was crazy. He was completely out of his mind. He was one of the worst leaders Africa's ever had. And his belief was we should all use Swahili. You go to Kampala today. You talk to people who speak Luganda. You try to get them to speak Swahili, okay? They're going to say, you know, you sound like Idi Amin. They're going to not let you into this. Do you know what's happening in Luganda right now? They've actually managed to get people to come to their city and speak their language. Not Swahili. Because if you move to Kampala, you're supposed to speak Luganda. They understand that. That's good. It's very similar to the language. But Swahili, forget that. That's Idi Amin. If you try to get one Africa together, it just isn't going to work. But spread Swahili, by all means. Try to spread it to Mozambique. Great. Spread it to parts of Kenya. Great. Maybe even Congo. Maybe. But don't try to spread it to South Sudan. Don't try to spread it to Nigeria, to Senegal. If you can spread it to some extent, yes. But this idea that Africa is one is nonsense. And now I understand you are a Tanzanian. You have an experience which is pretty good. I don't know very much, but evidently your experience with Swahili has worked out pretty well, I think. But that doesn't mean it applies to the rest of Africa. And you need to learn about the rest of Africa before you start constructing fantasies in your mind about the rest of Africa. Okay? But if you can convince Kenya to divide up into 3 different countries, that would be great. Because when they tried to impose Swahili on Kenya, the Nilotic speakers didn't want it. The Kalenjin refused. They had huge fights over it. And that's just Kenya, let alone if you try to do it in Nigeria. It isn't going to work. Okay? But Swahili is great, no question, but in its limited domain. But its limited domain is 200 million speakers. That's pretty good. Okay? That's more than most languages in the world, but not 1 billion.
All right. In Indonesian experience, yeah, just a second. Indonesian experience itself is also, Javanese is not our majority language, right? Although Javanese are the majority in Indonesia, but we accept that the language we use as national communication is Indonesian, and that's fine. It doesn't, so it means that it's not impossible to use one lingua franca across different states. We have about more than 200 local languages, and we don't understand each other when they speak in their own language. For example, I have a Madurese friend or Sundanese friend. I don't understand them. But when we speak in Indonesian, of course, we understand each other. As long as they can agree on this use of a single national language, it doesn't really matter. Be it whatever language it is, as long as you agree on this, like what happened to Indonesia, it doesn't matter. No one is feeling being colonized, although probably there
are people who feel they're colonized.
Yeah, I know. For example, I remember in the early years, Pramudia Anantatur, our famous poet, suggested Javanese writers to write in their own Javanese language. Do not write in Indonesian, because it is not your mother tongue, it's not your mother language. If you write in Indonesian, you sound strange, right? But see, now everybody is writing and speaking in Indonesian, it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
But the variation in Indonesia between Javanese, Madurese, Indonesian, Sundanese, it isn't that
linguistically
great.
speaking.
It isn't that great.
Okay.
If you compare it with the situation, and it's more similar, I think, to the situation if you compare Tanzania, if you compare Mozambique, if you compare South Africa, that's comparable. Okay? But if you start going to West Africa or the Nilotic area, it's much more different.
Okay. Yes, please. Introduce your name and where you're from, right?
Thank you. My name is Nixon and I'm from Tanzania.
Okay.
Yeah, actually I really appreciate what our presenters have been talking. Yeah, but I'm really sad the way they are undermining our language, especially Kiswahili, and the way they are talking about Africa. Yeah, we are Africans, and I think it's a time as Africans to think and to talk deeply concerning our Africa. Because it seems that we are there as Africans, but we know nothing about Africa.
Right.
They are talking about our continent, and this is really giving us a situation of feeling inferior. So I just think about Indonesia. Indonesia, I think its population is quite big, but it has been united by one country, language I mean, but still they have their own language, like Javanese, Bali and Sumatra, they speak their own language. So it's possible. So I think these people help us to do the researches, and they know better maybe on the other hand about Africa, but sometimes they should leave us decide on our own, because they always want us to be decided on behalf, and this is the problem. Like our professor didn't say that we should take Swahili as African language. No. She said if it's possible and it's good Africans to copy with our Swahili, it's okay. But we are not forcing anyone to use our language. So African right now should come on the table and decide which language. Okay, might be not possible to take maybe Kiswahili, I don't know, Zulu and whatever. If we decide to take English and we focus on English to unite us, it's okay, no problem. But what we want to say, like in your country, we are using Swahili, but I'm not quite good in speaking good Swahili. So our country can reformulate again, use like Indonesia doing, using Bahasa Indonesia in all systems, like in education, in governance, and whatever. Okay? So it's possible, it takes time. Of course, I know it takes time, but it's possible. And we need to be passionate on that. And they should give us space. Not telling us that it's not possible and what. No. It's possible. We can do that, and we are sure we can do that. Yeah, he has said about, I know, not majority are talking about, are using Swahili in Kampala, Nairobi, and whatever country in Africa. But for sure, Professor, I know you know many things about Africa. Some of people understand Kiswahili in Africa.
That's right.
So you should not say nonsense. This is we don't feel good. Saying it's nonsense, it's not good. So respect our language, respect our values, respect our culture. We really appreciate your efforts on investigating our Africa, helping Africa. We know that you really want to help us. But at least respect what we have and what we are doing. Saying nonsense doesn't bring sense that. Thank you.
Well, let me be more specific then, okay? Rather than talking about, maybe I should have said this more specifically before, but now thinking about this, rather than talking about spreading Swahili around Africa, I think what is more realistic is to see where Bantu languages are spoken. Wherever, and that's a lot of place, okay? If you try to spread Swahili to wherever Bantu language, so Bantu is a subfamily inside the Niger-Congo family. It does not include the languages of Senegal, for example, or the languages of Nigeria, but it includes all of the languages of the southern part of Africa, except for the Khoisan and the Bushman languages, okay? It includes all of those languages. If you want to spread Swahili among all of those countries, Malawi, Congo, not necessarily Cameroon, Rwanda, Mozambique, not Madagascar, obviously, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa. That's a good idea, or to try. That's not nonsense. That's realistic. To try to spread it to South Sudan, Nigeria, Senegal, this is nonsense. Okay, that won't work. I promise you that won't work, okay? But if you try to spread it to other areas where similar languages are spoken, then it might work. But all of Africa is not. Because Africa, it's just a concept, okay? You just look from, Europe is just a concept, okay? You look from the sky and you think this is the way people are. You have to consider the people on the ground, not the way the geology is. You have to consider the people on the ground. Sorry,
okay.
Sorry.
The lady over there, please. Yes.
My name.
Sorry?
My name is Mary.
Okay.
Yeah, I was really excited to attend to this conference because it's specifically in Africa and I'm African. I really wanted to hear about what are we going to discuss in this seminar, this conference. But for me, I think that I am African. We're Africans. And we understand better Africans than nobody else. We are Africans. And I think it's high time that we should be left to decide on our own. We understand Africans, we are Africans, we can decide on our own. And on top of that, I wanted to ask a question like, you know these languages like Portuguese, French. My mom is from Rwanda, okay? She speaks Rwandese and French, but my dad is from Tanzania. My dad speaks Tanzanian, Kiswahili and English, but my mom didn't know Kiswahili, but now she can speak Kiswahili. I speak Kiswahili. I speak like 4 languages. I speak Rwandese, I speak Kiswahili, I speak English, and I speak my father's tribal language, okay? So in my perspective, it's like these language ideologies of the Western are continue to shaping African politics, African economics, African education. For instance, in Africa, how you define education in Africa, it can be very different how you define education in the US. For example, for me in Africa, I cannot talk about this thing, LGBTQ. It's like these gender issues like identities. That is for us is a very, very very high topic. But in the US, you can define that anywhere. Maybe democracy, how you define democracy in the US is different how you define democracy in Africa. I cannot speak back at my father when he's speaking, but in the US, children can do that. So I think these languages in Africa, like colonial languages, are still some elements of colonialism, which at the end, they're still shaping Africans' politics, economics, education, and everything in Africa. So for me, I believe that it's high time that we should decide on our own whether we want a language. And it's not like we decided like Kiswahili should be a mother tongue in Africa. No, it's because our presidents, our leaders said, they said, and it's not like it just came from nowhere else. It's because Kiswahili has a long history. Maybe you are a language professor, you can research about that, the history of Kiswahili and all these stuffs. You can make a research about that too. It will be very helpful to us. But I think it's high time that we should be left alone to decide what language to use and what to do with our language. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I would like still to give the last couple of minutes to Professor Dephine Kessy as some kind of concluding remarks, because you know, I feel guilty for waking her up in the middle of the night from my WhatsApp. So please, Professor Dephine Kessy.
Thank you, Professor. I think it was not bad to wake me up because I was already ready to do the work, meaning I had prepared since yesterday. It is just because I missed the point a bit and you had to wake me up. So I only wanted to add or maybe talk something, you know, I really said it, that African states were in race before colonialism, and we had about 10,000 states already in terms of economic, in terms of social interaction, because of the interaction that existed. But before colonialism, Africa was not divided, say, in different states. There were only kingdoms and empires. And in a way of living, it is just like your home. You cannot wait for somebody to come and wait for your home, to make your living, to make you get something to eat. And this is how it was raising. And because of this Niger Congo, which is merely Bantu, you know, and of course Kiswahili is a Bantu language. You know, people in Tanzania understand people in Malawi, people in Mozambique in some words, if they use their traditional languages. People from the Congo, especially the Lingala itself, it's even the father of this Niger Congo. So in the end, in Africa, and this is where we are getting a population of more than 3 million people speaking Kiswahili. Because in Tanzania itself, Tanzania has got about 70 million people. So we cannot make 300 million. If you go to Nigeria, the Hausa people, the Yoruba, you know, Yoruba is spoken by only 45 million people. You get the point. So in general, what I'm saying here, the Niger Congo family, which is of course the father of Kiswahili, you know, has got an advantage of others. And I'm not saying people should eventually use Niger Congo or Nilo-Saharan, or of course, Khoisan is even more difficult because that's the click language which nobody can get easily. So in the end, I'm trying to say Africa was not divided before colonialism. Rather, the interactions and the empires which were coming up in terms of the advancement in economic well-being, that is what made these African states, African states be different. And of course, as I said, the modern day Zimbabwe could help other African countries to get stone houses, for example. And therefore, there was a very huge interaction between or among ourselves, you know. So the division came just after colonialism. And this is what we are saying. After the invasion of colonialism and the new languages, of course, confused the African states not to develop, and of course remain to be uncivilized the way they put it. And I don't get it if we were really uncivilized, or even today that we are uncivilized. So in the end, you know, this development did not, you know, quite a very fast pace as it was thought before. So we remained at a state of being stagnant. So we want to move away from where we are, because even this development, which is dependent on the Western countries or on the colonizers, you know, will not take us anywhere. We receive the donations, and are they really donations, for example? And it's because we don't understand each other. This difference in languages, when they tell you French is developing West Africa, is that real so? While the West Africa is paying taxi. And what was the cause of that? Probably the language that was used in making the MOUs, that even the forefathers, because there were translations, probably these translations were not as good as it was thought. In Tanzania, we have the same case. There's somebody who was called Chief Mangungo. The treaty that he made with, I don't know, the British colonialists, they're really, it's amazing, you know, it's really ridiculous. If you read that treaty, you would say, was this a chief or somebody else? So in the end, we are saying, if we have one common language which can tell us, which can make us understand each other and the needs that we have, you know, at the world stage. Remember, for example, this 1945 world order that was given by the Western countries and the US, and yet we were not involved because of language incompetence. I just believe this. And because they already thought that we are incapable of doing things, yet we were doing it before colonialism. So in the end, we are saying if we have one common language, whether it's Nilo-Saharan, I don't know, or Niger Congo, which of course is the father of Kiswahili. And that is why, because of this, I think even the African Union thought of Kiswahili, because it cuts across. Many people get it. Anyway, the Nilo-Saharan can come later, but it doesn't mean that they will not be taught. It is now, this Kiswahili, for example, has been accepted in South Africa, and these are the Khoisan, Khoisan speakers, and they are starting to teach Kiswahili in their schools. So little by little, we will get there. So what we need is one common language that can unite Africans and see what we can do for ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give big applause to the two presenters. Right, the audience and esteemed speakers, really thank you very much for your participation and your presentation in today's conference. Very intriguing question and debate ensuing in this meeting. It's very interesting. And if you are interested in post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory, you might want to join Magister KBI because we also offer those classes in, in our program. All right, we are running out of time, yeah, already now 12:30, and you and also we might have other programs to attend after this, so I'm really sorry that we have to close the session today. The fact that there are disagreements, of course, is the characteristic of intellectual dialogue, yeah, which will make it even more interesting, probably to open another topic in time to come, correct? So we might then can have another session on a different topic related to post-colonial theory. Okay, I return the session to Clara.
Thank you, Pak Sarwoto, for smoothly, I think it's smoothly, ya, Pak, smoothly guiding us throughout the session. And once again, I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Myhill and also Professor Dephine Kessy, for the insightful materials and presentations. And for the next session, we will be handing the certificates to our speakers, and it will be followed by a photo session as well. The certificates will be handed by the Director of the Graduate Program of Universitas SANATA DHARMA, Bapak FX Mukarto, PhD. Therefore, I would like to invite Pak Mukarto to hand the certificates to our speakers.
Yeah, this one's different. Yeah, you can.
And of course, souvenir and certificates for our second speaker, because Professor Dephine Kessy is not here in person. It will be sent to Tanzania, so she will be receiving the certificate as well. Let's give a round of applause for our speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I would like to invite everyone to come forward to take a picture together. My apologies. Before we have the photo session, we will show the certificate, so hand the certificate via online. All right, Pak. All right. All right, let's give a round of applause for our moderator for today, Pak Sarwoto. Thank you, Pak. And the next one for our second speaker, Professor Dephine. Professor Dephine, are you with us today still?
I'm still there. Thank you so much. I see it. Yeah.
Yes, so hopefully you will be receiving the certificate in person soon, not taking too long for the delivery by mail. We will be sending the certificate by mail. All right.
Right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dephine. All right, I would like to invite our dear participants today to join us at the front to take a picture together. Let's go. We will have Professor Dephine as well joining us from the screen, via the screen on the left. So we will have the line diagonally. Boleh maju sedikit, Pak. Jadi buat miring seperti ini, Pak. Masih lebar. There are still plenty of room, so let's join in the middle. Oh, there are still plenty of room at the front. Feel free to fill the room at the front. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have finally reached the end of today's event. And I would like to thank our speakers, all participants and attendees for joining ELS Talk and showing an immense enthusiasm throughout each session. I hope what we have learned from today's presentation would be enlightening and useful for all of us. And we have already provided a lunch box for all the participants, so feel free to get the lunch box outside. And everyone, this has been your MC, Clara. Good afternoon and God bless us all. Thank you.
I didn't understand what you said. So he wanted, you said he wanted Javanese to write in Javanese, but
Yes,
he was Javanese.
he said that.
But he didn't
said
write in
that.
Javanese himself.
No, because he is good in Indonesian. But when you observe other Javanese writing in Indonesian,